What I'm going to do is get my clothing model out of Marvelous Designer 10 and import it into Daz Studio 4.15. First of all, I took a Genesis 8.0 female character in the A pose and exported it as an OBJ. And I'm using that as the avatar in Marvelous Designer. So the clothing I've simulated in Marvelous Designer, I know it will fit the Genesis 8.0 or 8.1 models within Daz. I've made a fairly simple short sleeve dress with a belt around the middle, and I've assigned 3 different materials. I've done this because once I'm in Daz, I may want to add some transparency to the body material to look more like real cotton in sunlight. The belt might get a different texture within Daz Studio, and the trim I can either leave as is or change the colours. So the 3 materials I'm using here will appear as surfaces within Daz Studio eventually. In the UV editor of Marvelous Designer, just make sure all your materials fit within that 0 to 1 square in the centre. You can always tell it to fit. Make sure there's no overlaps on your parts. Once you've got your UV map set up, if you go to File, Export, you've got 2 ways of getting it into Daz. If you export as an OBJ, what you get is an OBJ file with the UV mapping on. But what it will do is it will create a separate surface for each object within your model. So there'll be one for the skirt, and one for the chest, and one for the back, and one for the back of the skirt, and one for that sleeve trim, one for that sleeve trim. You'll end up with a lot of surfaces. If you export it as a FBX, what it'll do is it will create a single surface for each material instead. But either way you do it, you want to export it as a single object, thin geometry, welded. If you don't weld it, it'll fall apart when you try and simulate it in Daz. If you just want to make some conforming clothing with elaborate thicknesses and ruffles and all the rest of it, you may want to send it out as a thick object, but you can't weld it and you won't be able to animate it in dForce. So given I want to use this in dForce, I want it thin and welded. I want to include the UV coordinates, but I don't need the diffuse maps at the moment. I'm going to export the FBX first, and then in the UV editor of Marvelous Designer, I'm going to bake the textures. So if I create these as tutorial maps just for reference, I want to create a diffuse, a normal and a roughness. I don't need opacity or metalness because there's no properties for those in my model. I only need the 0 to 1 area because that's where I've put all of my objects, and I've increased my pixel size on my maps to 8K. The default is about 4K, but if you put it as high as you need, 8K I'll just allowing for a bit more scrutiny on the close-ups. But that will render the UV map at 8K, and it will match the UV coordinates on the FBX file we've created. And this will create 3 files that we're then going to use in Daz. We'll see that. We'll close that. Make sure the simulation's turned off. And switch to Daz. Right, my character's in a pose already. Let's just make sure we're on it. Let's freeze the hair, because we're going to be doing some simulation and I don't want the hair moving. So pick my character, get a file, import, pick my short sleeve tutorial FBX. Now what it's done is it's imported the dress and the avatar. It's created them as separate objects, so we'll just delete the avatar. Now pick the dress. I want to rename it the short sleeve dress. With that selected, go to Edit, Object, Transfer Utility. What we're going to do is transfer the rigging from the Genesis character to the dress. So there's my Genesis female, there's my dress. The projection template affects the weighting of the various components of the dress to say which body part it follows. So in this case I'm just going to use the knee length dress because it's the most appropriate for what I'm using. And accept that. Now you could get away with leaving it at that. You don't need to simulate it under dForce if you don't need to. Most of the time, you know, a pair of trousers would look fine, but with a dress you've got overhang. You know, you've got shape to it. There's more gravity effect on loose clothing, so what we'll do pick the short sleeve dress again, edit object geometry, and add a dForce modifier dynamic surface. That will enable the simulation here. It'll also, on the surfaces, give me some extra properties for the materials. Now, after looking on various Daz forums, if you leave the stiffness properties as default, you could get a bit of an explosion on your polygons. Results vary, but you get more results, better results. If you change your stretch stiffness to 0.55 and change the bend stiffness to 0.05. Now I've done that on the dress, which has affected all 3 of the surfaces. Now what I'm going to do, before I simulate it, I'm going to change my diffuse colour and set it equal to the diffuse map I baked. I'm going to set the colour to a grey just to tone down the brightness of it. And what we'll see on here, it's now pulled through the UV texture and applied it to the model of the dress, like that. So dull it down a bit more. There we go. I'm going to apply a preset to my model. I'm going to give it the Uber base properties. What I'll do in the editor is it'll give me some properties that I recognise. So I've got a diffuse roughness now, And for that, come on, I raise a bit of a hog of the system. Change to filament. Change the diffuse roughness and pick up the roughness texture it baked. And the normal map. And pick up the normal texture. What that'll do is it'll bring back some of the stitch lines, some of the texture to the materials. So it looks about correct. We go to simulate. Oops. Not yet. On the simulation settings, we want to start the bones from a memorized pose. So it will go from the A pose that you created your object in, and instead of using the conforming shape that we've given it, it's going to simulate it completely by dForce. So it wasn't necessary to make it a conforming clothing. You could have left it just stuck in the A pose, but by making it conforming, you can see how it will look against your posed object before you do the simulation. So start from memorized pose. I've set the transition time to 2 seconds, and I've set the stabilization to 2 seconds. I think that's normally 1, so mine will take additional frames to move from the A frame to the pose, just so it's easier to simulate. So click on simulate. There it starts in the A frame, and it just transforms the Genesis character into the pose, and it hangs the cloth of the clothing using the gravity settings you've set in your simulation, which are normally set to, things fall down. And as it moves, I've got it set to the best collision option, so that it recalculates all of the collisions every frame on every polygon. So I may fast forward this bit so you don't have to sit and wait with me. Once it gets to the 100% of the simulating from memorized pose, it will then run through a stabilization, and all that does is it gives the material extra frames to drape. Once the characters stop moving into the position, it lets everything settle. What you can see here is because we're using dForce, the back of the dress is hanging from gravity. It's not following the leg as it moves forwards like it would with conforming clothing, and that's the main advantage of using dForce. More realism. You can also see on the front of the leg the fabric is moving forwards with it in a realistic way instead of simply following the position. So coming up to 93%. Not too bad. 2 minutes 20. Now it's going through the stabilizing simulation. As I say, this is continuing to let the fabric rest after all that movement. You don't have to let it run through all of this. If you've got an action pose, you might sometimes want the clothing to be in that action, in motion. You might not want to let it hang, but however long you leave it before you cancel, it won't reset it once it's on the stabilizing. So there you go. There is the clothing draped with dForce with all the textures I wanted. Move that to iRay. And there we go. So that is how you can get your dynamic clothing into Daz from Marvelous Designer.